The Duke's Forbidden Heart, a tale of impossible desire, loyalty, and devastating choices in England, 1813. He saw her, and the world stopped. One glance was all it took for Eduardo Ashford, Duke of Thornfield, to realize that this woman with emerald eyes and a voice like silk would be his undoing. But fate is cruel. She wasn't meant for him. She was promised to his brother. And yet, from that very first moment, he loved her with a quiet, desperate intensity that would consume them both. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're from. This story will take you on a journey you won't forget. The rain hammered against the windows of Ashford Manor with relentless fury, as if the heavens themselves were mourning something not yet lost. Eduardo stood by the towering window in the east wing, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. The amber liquid caught the firelight, swirling like a storm trapped in crystal. But his eyes were fixed beyond the glass, on the carriage approaching through the downpour. His brother's betrothed was arriving. He had been told her name once, in passing. Elizabeth Sinclair, daughter of the late Earl of Devonshire, a woman of impeccable lineage and, according to his mother, suitable disposition. The words had meant nothing to him then. They were simply another arrangement in a world built on duty and bloodlines. But now, as the carriage wheels crunched over gravel and came to a halt beneath the stone archway, something inside him shifted, a subtle unease, like the air before a lightning strike. The carriage door opened, and she stepped out. Eduardo's breath caught. She moved with the kind of grace that seemed impossible in the chaos of the storm. Her cloak billowed behind her, heavy with rain, but she didn't rush, didn't flinch. She tilted her face toward the sky for just a moment, letting the rain kiss her skin, and then, only then, did she turn toward the manor. The firelight from the entrance illuminated her features. High cheekbones, lips pressed into a soft, unreadable line, and eyes, God, those eyes, green as the English countryside after spring rain, sharp and alive with something he couldn't name. He should have looked away. He didn't. She glanced up as if sensing the weight of his stare, and their gazes locked across the distance. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent. No rain, no wind, no duty. Just her. Just him. Just the unbearable pull of something neither of them had asked for. Then she looked away and the spell shattered. Eduardo set the glass down, his hand trembling in a way that infuriated him. He was a duke, a man of logic and control. He did not tremble. He did not lose himself to foolish sentiment. And yet his heart hammered against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. Behind him, the heavy door to the drawing room creaked open. "She's here." His mother's voice was clipped, efficient. The Duchess of Thornfield did not deal in emotions. She dealt in outcomes. "Your brother is waiting in the hall. You will greet her with him, as is proper." Eduardo turned slowly, his expression a mask of indifference. Of course. But as he descended the grand staircase, each step felt heavier than the last. He told himself it was nothing, a passing curiosity, a trick of the light. He told himself he was not falling. He told himself lies. The entrance hall was a cathedral of cold marble and gold. Chandeliers dripped with candlelight, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. His brother, William, stood at the center of it all, dressed in a perfectly tailored coat, his posture relaxed, his smile easy. William had always been easy, charming, beloved, the golden son who could do no wrong. Eduardo had always been the storm to William's sunshine. "There you are, brother." William's voice was warm, genuine. He clapped Eduardo on the shoulder as if they were the closest of friends. They weren't. Not anymore. Not since their father's death had placed the title on Eduardo's shoulders and left William with nothing but resentment, disguised as good humor. "I wouldn't miss it," Eduardo replied, his tone neutral. The doors opened. Elizabeth stepped inside, flanked by two servants who took her cloak and gloves with silent efficiency. Beneath the heavy wool, she wore a gown of pale blue muslin, simple yet elegant, the empire waist accentuating the delicate curve of her frame. Her dark hair was pinned back, a few loose strands curling against her neck. She looked like a painting brought to life. William moved forward immediately, all smiles and practiced charm. "Miss Sinclair, welcome to Ashford Manor. I trust the journey was not too arduous." She turned toward him, and Eduardo watched the careful smile she gave in return. Polite, measured, the kind of smile one gives a stranger. "It was long, my lord, but I am grateful to have arrived safely." Her voice. God, her voice. Low and soft, like velvet brushed against skin. It wrapped around Eduardo's senses, pulling him under. "Please call me William. We are to be family after all." William reached for her hand, lifting it to his lips in a gesture Eduardo had seen him perform 100 times before. But when Elizabeth's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward Eduardo, something in her expression changed. A flicker of recognition, of awareness. She felt it too. Eduardo's jaw tightened. He forced himself to step forward, to offer the expected pleasantries. "Miss Sinclair." "I am Eduardo, Duke of Thornfield, welcome." Her gaze met his, and the air between them thickened. She dipped into a graceful curtsy, but her eyes never left his. "Your Grace. It is an honor." The words were proper, expected. But the way she said them, the slight tremor beneath the surface, spoke of something else entirely. "The honor is ours," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. William, oblivious, laughed. "Come, Elizabeth. Let me show you to your chambers. You must be exhausted." She nodded, but as she turned to follow William, her eyes lingered on Eduardo for just a moment longer. A silent question, a dangerous acknowledgement, and then she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. Eduardo stood alone in the hall, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart a traitor in his chest. He had loved her from the very first moment, and she belonged to his brother. The manor settled into an uneasy quiet, as the storm outside began to soften into a steady drizzle. Elizabeth stood by the window of her chambers, her fingertips resting lightly against the cold glass. The room was grand, too grand perhaps. Silk curtains the color of deep wine framed the tall windows. A four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in linens so fine they seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth she didn't quite feel. She should have been relieved, grateful even. This was her future, a future secured by duty, by the arrangement her late father had made before his death. William Ashford was kind, handsome, everything a woman could reasonably hope for in a husband. And yet, she closed her eyes, but the image refused to fade. Dark eyes, sharp jawline, the way he had looked at her, not with curiosity, not with politeness, but with something raw and unmistakable. Eduardo, the Duke, her betrothed's brother. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, willing herself to be sensible. She had no right to think of him, no right to let that single moment linger in her mind like a forbidden song. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning away from the window. A young maid entered, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. "Miss Sinclair, dinner will be served in an hour. The Duchess requests your presence in the drawing room beforehand." Elizabeth nodded, smoothing the fabric of her gown. "Thank you, I'll be down shortly." The maid curtsied and left, the door clicking softly behind her. Elizabeth took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had faced far worse than a formal dinner. She had survived her father's death, the crumbling of her family's fortune, the whispers of society that followed her like shadows. She could survive this. She had to. The drawing room was smaller than the entrance hall, but no less intimidating. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow every movement. The Duchess sat near the fire, her posture as rigid as the high-backed chair she occupied. Her silver hair was swept into an immaculate coiffure, and her gown, deep emerald silk, spoke of wealth and authority. She did not smile when Elizabeth entered. "Miss Sinclair, please sit." The Duchess gestured to the chair opposite her. Elizabeth obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, her spine straight. "I trust your chambers are to your liking?" "They are more than adequate, Your Grace." "Thank you." The Duchess studied her with cool, assessing eyes. "You come from a good family. Your father was well respected, though his finances were less prudent." Elizabeth's cheeks warmed, but she kept her expression calm. "My father did his best with the circumstances he was given." "Of course." The Duchess's tone suggested she thought otherwise. "You understand, I'm sure, that this union is beneficial for both our families. William is a good man. He will provide for you. In return, you will uphold the dignity of this house. You will be discreet, dutiful, and above reproach." The words landed like stones. "I understand, Your Grace." "Good." The Duchess lifted her teacup, taking a delicate sip. "There is one other matter." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "Yes?" "My elder son, Eduardo." The Duchess set the cup down with a soft clink. "He is complicated, brilliant but often distant. He does not warm to strangers easily. Do not take offense if he seems aloof. It is simply his nature." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "I will keep that in mind." The Duchess's gaze sharpened. "See that you do." Before Elizabeth could respond, the door opened and Eduardo entered. He had changed for dinner. His coat was midnight black, perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders. His cravat was tied with precision, and his dark hair, still slightly damp from washing, fell just over his brow. He looked every inch the Duke, powerful, untouchable, dangerous, and when his eyes found hers, the air left the room. "Mother," he said, his voice low and even. "Miss Sinclair." "Eduardo." The Duchess's tone softened just slightly. "We were just discussing the upcoming arrangements." "I see." He moved to the sideboard, pouring himself a glass of wine with deliberate slowness. His movements were controlled, precise, but Elizabeth could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the slight tightness in his jaw. He was fighting something too. The door opened again, and William swept in, all brightness and laughter. "Ah, the family gathers. Elizabeth, you look radiant. That shade of blue suits you beautifully." She smiled, grateful for the distraction. "You're too kind, William." He crossed the room and took her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. It was warm, friendly, comfortable. It felt like nothing. Eduardo's gaze darkened and he turned away, lifting the glass to his lips. "Shall we go into dinner?" the Duchess suggested, rising gracefully. William offered Elizabeth his arm, and she took it, allowing him to guide her toward the dining hall. But as they passed Eduardo, she felt the weight of his stare like a hand against her spine. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. Dinner was an exercise in restraint. The table was laden with roasted pheasant, fresh bread, vegetables glazed in butter, and wine that shimmered like rubies in the candlelight. Conversation flowed easily. William charmed, the Duchess directed, and Elizabeth played her part with practiced grace. But across the table, Eduardo sat in silence. He ate little, spoke less. His dark eyes remained fixed on his plate, but Elizabeth could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a flame. "Eduardo, you're unusually quiet tonight," William observed, his tone light but edged with something sharper. "Surely you have some thoughts on our upcoming nuptials?" Eduardo's jaw tightened. He set down his fork with deliberate care. "I wish you both every happiness." The words were correct, expected, but the way he said them, flat, hollow, made Elizabeth's chest ache. William laughed, oblivious. "Well, that's settled then." "Elizabeth, you must tell us, what do you enjoy most? Music, riding, embroidery?" She forced a smile. "I enjoy reading, actually, and long walks when the weather permits." "Ah, a woman of intellect. How refreshing." William raised his glass. "To Elizabeth, a perfect addition to our family." Everyone lifted their glasses. Elizabeth sipped, the wine bitter on her tongue. Eduardo did not drink. After dinner, Elizabeth excused herself, claiming exhaustion. She couldn't bear another moment in that room, feeling the weight of Eduardo's silence pressing against her, like a storm waiting to break. She walked through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. The manor was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, and she felt small within its vastness. She turned a corner and collided with a solid chest. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her. She looked up. Eduardo. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. His eyes, God, those eyes, burned with something wild and unspoken. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I didn't see you." "No," he said quietly. "You didn't." But he didn't let go. For a heartbeat they stood frozen, the world narrowing to just the two of them. She could feel the heat of his hands through the thin fabric of her gown, could see the conflict raging behind his eyes. "I should go," she breathed. "You should." But neither of them moved. His thumb brushed against her shoulder just once, barely a touch, and it sent fire racing through her veins. Then he released her, stepping back as if burned. "Forgive me, Miss Sinclair, that was inappropriate." "It was an accident," she managed. He looked at her for a long moment, something broken and desperate flickering across his face. "Was it?" And then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the shadows, her heart pounding and her world unraveling. Elizabeth did not sleep that night. She lay in the vast bed, staring at the canopy above her, watching shadows dance across the fabric as the fire burned low. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, felt the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, heard the rough edge in his voice when he'd asked, "Was it?" She turned onto her side, pulling the coverlet tighter around herself, as if it could shield her from the truth she didn't want to face. She was engaged to William. She had no right to think of Eduardo, and yet she did, over and over like a prayer she couldn't stop whispering. When dawn finally broke, pale and hesitant through the rain-streaked windows, Elizabeth rose and dressed herself without calling for the maid. She needed air, space, something to clear her mind before she had to face them all again. She slipped out of her chambers and down the servants' staircase, a route she'd noticed the previous evening. The manor was still asleep, silent except for the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped out into the gardens. The rain had stopped, but the world was soaked. Droplets clung to every leaf, every blade of grass glittering like diamonds in the early light. The air smelled of earth and roses, fresh and clean, and for the first time since arriving, Elizabeth felt like she could breathe. She walked along the gravel path, her slippers growing damp, her mind quieting with each step. The garden was beautiful, meticulously maintained, with hedges trimmed into perfect lines and flower beds bursting with color despite the season. At the center stood a marble fountain, water trickling softly from the mouth of a stone lion. Elizabeth stopped beside it, trailing her fingers through the cool water, letting the rhythm soothe her. "You're up early," she gasped, spinning around. Eduardo stood a few paces away, his coat unbuttoned, his cravat loose around his neck. His dark hair was tousled, as if he'd run his hands through it too many times. He looked tired, raw, like he hadn't slept either. I needed some air," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. So did I. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the fountain, the distant call of birds waking in the trees. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, taking a small step back. "You're not." He moved closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "This garden belongs to the house. You have every right to be here." "Do I?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" She looked away, her throat tight. "I mean, I don't know what I'm doing here, Your Grace. I don't know who I'm supposed to be. I came here to marry your brother, to fulfill a duty, to be suitable. But I feel like a stranger in my own skin." The words hung between them, vulnerable and dangerous. Eduardo was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "You're not alone in that." She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" He took another step closer, and suddenly the space between them felt impossibly small. She could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, the tension in the line of his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each carefully measured breath. "I'm saying," he murmured, "that from the moment I saw you, nothing has felt right, nothing has made sense, and I hate it." Her breath caught. "Eduardo, don't." His voice was sharp but not unkind. "Don't say my name like that, not when you're promised to him." "I didn't choose this," she whispered. "I didn't choose any of this." "Neither did I." His hand lifted, as if to touch her face, but he stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. "But it doesn't change what is." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Then what do we do?" He looked at her for a long, aching moment. "We do what we must. You marry William. You become the Duchess you were meant to be, and I—" His voice broke just slightly. "I let you go. And if I don't want to be let go—" The words escaped before she could stop them, raw and desperate. Eduardo's expression shattered. For a heartbeat she saw everything he'd been hiding, the longing, the pain, the impossible weight of wanting something he could never have. Then he stepped back, his mask sliding back into place. It doesn't matter what we want, Elizabeth, it never has. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid, his pace measured and controlled. But Elizabeth saw the truth in the way his hands trembled at his sides. He was breaking too. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Breakfast was a stilted affair, with William chattering cheerfully about wedding preparations while the Duchess outlined expectations with clinical precision. Eduardo was absent, claiming business in the study. Elizabeth nodded and smiled and played her part, but inside she was unraveling. That afternoon, William insisted on showing her the library, a vast, echoing room lined with shelves that stretched to the ceiling. Books in leather bindings filled every inch of space, their spines cracked with age and use. "This is my favorite room in the entire manor," William said, spreading his arms wide. "My father spent hours here. Eduardo does too, though he'd never admit it." Elizabeth ran her fingers along the spines, the scent of old paper and ink grounding her. "It's beautiful. You're welcome to spend as much time here as you like. Consider it yours." William's smile was warm, genuine. She turned to him, guilt twisting in her chest. He was kind. He didn't deserve to be hurt by something he didn't even know existed. "Thank you, William. That's very generous." He stepped closer, taking her hand gently in his. "Elizabeth, I know this arrangement wasn't of your choosing. I know we're strangers thrust together by circumstance. But I want you to know, I will do everything in my power to make you happy." Her throat tightened. "You're a good man." "I try to be." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Give me time. Let me prove myself to you." She wanted to tell him the truth, wanted to scream that her heart was already lost to someone she could never have. But instead she nodded, her smile fragile and false. Of course. He left her there alone among the books, and Elizabeth sank into a chair by the window, pressing her face into her hands. She couldn't do this. She couldn't marry William while every fiber of her being pulled toward Eduardo, but she had no choice. That evening a storm rolled in, darker and more violent than the one that had welcomed her. Thunder shook the windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts of white. Elizabeth stood in her chambers, watching the fury outside, feeling it echo in her chest. A knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she called, expecting the maid. The door opened. Eduardo stepped inside. Her breath stopped. "Your Grace, this is highly inappropriate." "I know." He closed the door behind him, his expression tortured. "I know, but I couldn't stay away. Not tonight. Not knowing you're under the same roof, so close, and yet—" He broke off, his voice ragged. "Eduardo, you have to leave. If someone sees, let them see." He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just before her, his eyes wild and desperate. "I can't do this, Elizabeth. I can't stand beside my brother and watch him marry you. I can't pretend that I don't—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. "Don't what?" she whispered, her heart hammering. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything. "That I don't love you." The world tilted. "You can't say that," she breathed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know." His hand lifted, trembling, and this time he didn't stop himself. His palm cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with heartbreaking tenderness. "I know it's wrong. I know it's impossible. But it's the truth. From the very first moment, Elizabeth. From the very first breath." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, her own hand covering his. "I feel it too. God help me. I feel it too." His forehead dropped to hers, and for a moment they simply stood there, breathing each other in. The storm raging outside and inside, relentless and unforgiving. "We can't do this," she whispered. "I know. It will destroy everything." "I know." But neither of them moved. Thunder cracked, shaking the walls, and in that moment, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Eduardo's lips found hers. The kiss was soft, desperate, achingly tender, not a claim, but a surrender. A confession whispered against her mouth. "I'm yours. I've always been yours." Elizabeth's hands fisted in his coat, pulling him closer, even as tears streamed down her face. It was wrong. It was beautiful. It was everything she'd never known she needed. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were shaking. "We can't," she said again, her voice breaking. I know. He pressed one last kiss to her forehead, slow and reverent. But for this one moment, I needed you to know. You are not alone in this, Elizabeth. Whatever happens, you are not alone. And then, before she could stop him, he turned and left, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. Elizabeth sank to the floor, her hand pressed to her lips, her heart shattered and whole all at once. The storm raged on. The morning after the kiss, Elizabeth woke to a world that felt both sharper and more fragile than before. Every sound, the rustle of sheets, the crackle of the fire being stoked by the maid, seemed amplified. Every breath she took carried the memory of Eduardo's touch, the taste of his lips, the weight of words that could never be unsaid. I love you. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself to think clearly. But clarity was a luxury she no longer possessed. A soft knock came at the door, followed by the maid's tentative voice. Miss Sinclair, the Duchess requests your presence in the morning room. She wishes to discuss the wedding preparations. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. Tell her I'll be down shortly. She dressed with trembling hands, choosing a gown of pale lavender muslin that felt too delicate for the storm brewing inside her. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back, eyes too bright, cheeks too flushed, lips still tender from a kiss that should never have happened. She forced herself to take a breath, then another. You are Elizabeth Sinclair. You know your duty. You will fulfill it, even if it killed her. The morning room was awash in golden light, though the brightness felt like a mockery. The Duchess sat at a small writing desk, surrounded by fabric samples, guest lists, and meticulously organized correspondence. She looked up as Elizabeth entered, her expression pleasant but assessing. Ah, Miss Sinclair, please sit. She gestured to the chair across from her. We have much to accomplish. The wedding is only 6 weeks away, and there are 1,000 details to attend to. Elizabeth lowered herself into the chair, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. Of course, Your Grace. I'm at your disposal. The Duchess smiled, a thin, calculated expression. Excellent. Now, first we must decide on the flowers. I'm inclined toward white roses and peonies, classic and dignified. Unless you have a preference. Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She could still feel Eduardo's hand cradling her face, his breath warm against her skin, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Miss Sinclair? She blinked, forcing herself back to the present. White roses sound lovely. Good. And your gown. I've taken the liberty of contacting Madame Dubois in London. She's the finest modiste in England. She'll arrive next week to take your measurements. That's very generous, Your Grace. The Duchess waved a dismissive hand. It's not generosity. It's necessity. You will be representing this family. You must look the part. The words stung, though Elizabeth wasn't sure why. Perhaps because they confirmed what she already knew. She was not a person in this arrangement. She was a piece on a chessboard, moved into position to secure alliances and preserve reputations. The door opened, and William strode in, his face bright with a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Good morning, ladies. Am I interrupting? Not at all, the Duchess said. We were just discussing the arrangements. Elizabeth has agreed to white roses. Perfect choice. William crossed to Elizabeth's side, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to it. The gesture was warm, affectionate, and utterly unbearable. She forced herself to smile. Thank you. I was hoping, William continued, that you might join me for a ride this afternoon. The weather has cleared, and I thought it would be lovely to show you the estate. There's a lake on the far edge of the property, quite beautiful this time of year. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She wanted to refuse, to find some excuse to hide away in her chambers and avoid the charade. But that wasn't an option. That sounds wonderful, she heard herself say. Splendid. William's grin widened. We'll leave after luncheon. As he turned to leave, the Duchess called after him. William, have you seen your brother this morning? He missed breakfast. William paused, his expression flickering with something Elizabeth couldn't quite read. Eduardo keeps his own schedule, Mother, you know that. Indeed. The Duchess's tone was cool. Still, it would be courteous of him to join us. This is a family matter after all. William's jaw tightened just slightly. I'll remind him. He left, and the Duchess returned her attention to the lists before her. as if the conversation had never happened. But Elizabeth felt the shift in the air, the tension that seemed to follow Eduardo's name like a shadow. Luncheon was a quiet affair. William kept up a steady stream of pleasant conversation. The Duchess offered occasional commentary, and Elizabeth nodded and smiled in all the right places. Eduardo did not appear. Afterward, as promised, William led her to the stables. The afternoon sun was warm, and the air smelled of hay and leather. A groom brought out 2 horses, a chestnut mare for Elizabeth and a sleek black stallion for William. "This is Rosalind," William said, stroking the mare's neck. "Gentle as a lamb. You'll have no trouble with her." Elizabeth ran her hand along the horse's mane, finding comfort in the simple, honest connection. "She's beautiful." They mounted and set off across the grounds, the horse's hooves thudding softly against the grass. The estate was vast. Rolling hills dotted with ancient oaks, stone walls covered in ivy, and wildflowers swaying in the breeze. It should have been peaceful, but Elizabeth's mind was elsewhere. "You're quiet today," William observed, glancing over at her. "Is something troubling you?" She forced herself to meet his eyes. "No, just adjusting, I suppose." "I understand. This is all very new." He slowed his horse to match her pace. "But I want you to know, Elizabeth, you can talk to me. About anything. I may not have all the answers, but I promise to listen." Guilt twisted in her chest like a knife. He was so kind, so earnest, and she was lying to him with every breath. "Thank you, William. That means a great deal." They rode in silence for a while, the landscape unfolding around them like a painting. Eventually they reached the lake, a wide expanse of still water, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Willow trees trailed their branches into the shallows, and dragonflies skimmed the surface. William dismounted and helped Elizabeth down, his hands steady and respectful. They walked to the water's edge, and for a moment she let herself imagine that this could be enough, that she could learn to love him, to build a life here, to bury the impossible longing that burned inside her. "Elizabeth," William said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Her pulse quickened. "Of course." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the water. "Do you think, in time, you could be happy here, with me?" The question was so vulnerable, so raw, that it broke something inside her. "I think," she said carefully, "that happiness is not always a choice. But I will try, William, I promise you that." He turned to her, his blue eyes searching hers. "That's all I can ask." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, even though it felt like a betrayal. They returned to the manor as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Elizabeth excused herself to her chambers, pleading exhaustion, and William accepted with a gentle smile. But as she climbed the stairs, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. She turned. Eduardo stood at the far end of the corridor, half hidden in shadow. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, God, his eyes, were filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. They stared at each other across the distance, the silence heavy and suffocating. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Elizabeth stood frozen for a long moment before continuing to her room, her heart aching with every step. That night, she couldn't sleep again. She paced her chambers, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and longing and fear. She thought about running, about fleeing into the night and never looking back. But where would she go? She had no money, no family, no future outside of this arrangement. She was trapped. A soft sound at the door made her freeze, not a knock, something else. A folded piece of paper slid beneath the frame. Elizabeth crossed the room and picked it up with trembling hands. The handwriting was bold, precise. "Meet me in the library. Midnight, please. No signature." But she knew. She should burn it. Pretend she never saw it. Stay in her room and do the right thing. But when the clock struck 12, Elizabeth found herself slipping through the darkened corridors, her heart pounding, her resolve crumbling with every step. The library door was ajar. Candlelight flickered within. She stepped inside. Eduardo stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. He didn't turn when she entered. "You came," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have." "I know." He turned then, and the look on his face nearly undid her. "But I needed to see you. Just once more." "Before—" He stopped, his voice breaking. Elizabeth crossed the room, stopping just before him. "Before what?" "Before I do the right thing." His hands clenched at his sides. "I'm leaving, Elizabeth. Tomorrow. I'll go to London, to our estate in Scotland, anywhere but here. I can't stay, not while you're—" He closed his eyes, pain etched into every line of his face. "I can't watch you marry him. I'm not that strong." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Eduardo, don't." His voice was rough. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "Then why did you ask me here?" she whispered. He looked at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes shattered her. "Because I needed you to know that what I feel for you, it's real. It's not some fleeting infatuation or moment of weakness. I love you, Elizabeth, and I will love you for the rest of my life, even if I never see you again." A sob escaped her. "I love you too. God help me, I do." For one heartbreaking moment, they stood there inches apart, the truth laid bare between them. Then Eduardo stepped back, putting distance between them like a chasm that could never be crossed. "Then this is goodbye." "Don't go," she pleaded. "Please, we'll find a way." "There is no way." His voice was firm, final. "Your promise to William. He's my brother, and no matter how much it destroys me, I will not be the man who tears this family apart." He moved toward the door, but Elizabeth caught his arm. "Eduardo, wait!" He turned, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, she rose on her toes and kissed him. Desperate, aching. A goodbye disguised as a plea. He kissed her back, his hands framing her face, pouring everything he couldn't say into that single shattering moment. When they broke apart, both of them were trembling. "Goodbye, Elizabeth," he whispered. And then he was gone. Elizabeth sank to the floor, her hand pressed to her mouth, her heart breaking into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Eduardo left before dawn. Elizabeth knew because she hadn't slept. She'd sat by her window through the endless hours of night, watching the horizon, waiting for the world to shift. And when the first grey light touched the sky, she saw him, a dark figure on horseback, riding hard toward the gates, his silhouette sharp against the breaking day. He didn't look back. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain, and watched until he disappeared beyond the tree line. Gone. The word echoed in her mind, hollow and final. She closed her eyes, but the tears came anyway, silent and relentless. Breakfast was unbearable. William noticed Eduardo's absence immediately, his brow furrowing as he glanced at the empty chair. "Mother, where's Eduardo?" The Duchess dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, her expression composed. "He left early this morning for London, business matters requiring his immediate attention." "London?" William's confusion was genuine. "He didn't mention anything to me." "He doesn't report to you, William." The Duchess's tone was cool, final. "He is the Duke. He goes where he pleases." William's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Elizabeth kept her gaze fixed on her plate, pushing food around without tasting it. Her chest felt hollow, scraped raw, as if something vital had been torn away. "Elizabeth, are you quite well?" The Duchess's sharp voice cut through the fog. "You've barely touched your breakfast." She forced herself to look up to manufacture a smile. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I'm simply not very hungry this morning." "You must eat. You're looking pale." The Duchess's concern was practical, not kind. "We cannot have you falling ill before the wedding." The wedding. The word felt like a stone dropping into dark water, sinking and sinking with no bottom in sight. "Of course," Elizabeth murmured. "You're right." She lifted her fork and forced herself to swallow, even though every bite tasted like ash. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of wedding preparations and forced smiles. Madame Dubois arrived from London with trunks full of silk and lace, measuring and pinning and tutting over every detail. The guest list grew longer. Invitations were sent. The manor buzzed with activity. Servants polishing silver, gardeners preparing the grounds, musicians hired to play at the reception. Elizabeth moved through it all like a ghost. William was attentive, kind, eager to please. He brought her flowers from the garden, read poetry to her in the library, took her on long walks where he spoke of their future with a hope that made her heart ache. And she smiled, nodded, played the role she'd been assigned. But at night, alone in her chambers, she would stand by the window and stare out at the darkness, wondering where Eduardo was. If he thought of her, if he regretted leaving, or if distance had already begun to dull the sharp edge of longing. She told herself it was better this way. She didn't believe it for a moment. 2 weeks passed, then 3. No word came from Eduardo. No letter, no message. It was as if he'd vanished from the world entirely. William never mentioned his brother's absence, though Elizabeth sometimes caught him staring at Eduardo's empty chair with an expression she couldn't quite name. Hurt, perhaps, or suspicion. She prayed he didn't suspect the truth. One afternoon, as Elizabeth sat in the drawing room with the Duchess reviewing seating arrangements for the wedding breakfast, William entered with a letter in his hand. His face was troubled. "Mother, I've just received word from London." He glanced at Elizabeth, then back to the Duchess. "Eduardo won't be returning for the wedding." Elizabeth's heart stopped. The Duchess set down her pen, her expression hardening. "What do you mean he won't be returning?" "He sent word through his solicitor. He's been called to Edinburgh on urgent business regarding the Scottish estate. He extends his regrets, but says it cannot be avoided." "That's absurd." The Duchess's voice was ice. "He is the head of this family. His presence is required." William's jaw clenched. Apparently he disagrees. Elizabeth's hands trembled in her lap. She clasped them tighter, willing herself to remain composed. But inside, something was fracturing. He wouldn't even come to the wedding. He was cutting himself off completely. "This is highly improper," the Duchess said sharply. "What will people think?" "Does it matter?" William's tone was sharper than Elizabeth had ever heard it. "Eduardo has never cared what people think. Why should he start now?" The Duchess's lips pressed into a thin line. "You will write to him. Tell him his absence will be noted, and not favorably." William didn't argue, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. Elizabeth excused herself quietly, slipping from the room before either of them could see the tears threatening to spill. She made it to the garden before she broke. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain, and the air was thick and oppressive. Elizabeth sank onto a stone bench beneath the willow tree, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. He was gone, truly, irrevocably gone, and she was going to marry his brother in less than 3 weeks. "Miss Sinclair?" she gasped, looking up. A young maid stood a few feet away, her expression tentative. "I'm sorry to disturb you, miss, but this came for you." She held out a small folded letter. It was left at the servants' entrance. No name, no seal. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She took the letter with trembling hands. "Thank you." The maid curtsied and hurried away. Elizabeth stared at the letter, her heart pounding. The handwriting was familiar, bold, precise. "Eduardo." She broke the seal with shaking fingers and unfolded the paper. "Elizabeth, forgive me. I know I said goodbye and I meant it, but I find that distance has not brought clarity, only torment. I cannot come to the wedding. I cannot stand in that church and watch you pledge yourself to another, even if that man is my brother, even if it is the right thing. I am not strong enough, but I need you to know this. My absence is not indifference. It is the opposite. It is the only way I can survive what comes next. You will be a beautiful bride. William is a fortunate man, and though it destroys me to say it, I hope you find happiness with him. I will carry you with me always, in the only place I have left, my heart. Forgive me." Elizabeth read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears. Then she pressed it to her chest, as if she could absorb the words into her skin, make them part of her. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, soaking through her gown, plastering her hair to her face. She didn't move. She sat there in the storm, clutching the letter, and let the rain wash away the tears she could no longer contain. That night, Elizabeth made a decision. She couldn't go through with this. It wasn't fair to William, it wasn't fair to herself, and it certainly wasn't fair to Eduardo, wherever he was, suffering in silence. She would call off the wedding. The scandal would be enormous. The Duchess would be furious. Her family's reputation, what little remained of it, would be destroyed. But she couldn't marry a man she didn't love, while her heart belonged to another. She had to tell William the truth. She rehearsed the words in her mind as she made her way to the library, where she knew he often spent his evenings. Her hands were clammy, her pulse erratic, but her resolve was firm. She would tell him. She had to. But when she reached the library, she found the door slightly ajar. Voices drifted out, William's and another she didn't recognize. She paused, her hand on the doorframe. "You're certain?" William was saying, his voice low and tense. "Absolutely, my lord." The other voice was older, formal. "I've seen the correspondence myself. The Duke has been in Edinburgh for barely a week. Before that, he was in London, alone." "And the woman?" Elizabeth's breath caught. "There is no woman, my lord. At least none that I could find. Whatever business he claims to have, it's not of a romantic nature." A long silence. Then William laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "So he's simply run away. How very like him." "My lord, if I may." "You may not." William's voice was sharp. "That will be all." Footsteps approached the door. Elizabeth quickly stepped back into the shadows as a man in a dark coat emerged and hurried down the corridor. She waited, her heart pounding, then stepped into the doorway. William stood by the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel, his head bowed. "William?" He turned sharply, his expression flickering from surprise to something guarded. "Elizabeth, I didn't hear you." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Are you all right?" He studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers. "That depends. Are you?" The question hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. Elizabeth's throat tightened. "William, there's something I need to tell you." "Is there?" He moved toward her, his expression unreadable. "Or is there something you've been trying not to tell me?" Her pulse spiked. "I don't understand." He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Don't you?" Silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. Finally, William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Elizabeth, I'm not blind, and I'm not a fool." Her stomach dropped. "William, I've seen the way you look when his name is mentioned, the way you go pale, the way your hands shake." His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry. Don't apologize." His tone softened, and to her shock he didn't sound angry, just tired. "I knew from the beginning, I think. I just didn't want to admit it." "William, I never meant—" "I know." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You're a good person, Elizabeth. You tried. And that's more than I had any right to expect." She looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears. "What do we do now?" William's expression was sad but resigned. "We do what we must. You love him. He loves you. And I—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "I deserve someone who loves me in return." "You do," she whispered. "You deserve so much more than this." He smiled, a bittersweet curve of his lips. "Then let's give ourselves a chance to find it." The morning after her conversation with William, Elizabeth woke to a strange, unsettling calm. The storm inside her had quieted, replaced by a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. William had agreed to call off the wedding, but the Duchess didn't know yet, and Eduardo, wherever he was, didn't know either. Elizabeth dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her gown. Her reflection in the mirror looked different somehow. The same face, the same eyes, but something had shifted beneath the surface. She was no longer the woman who had arrived at Ashford Manor weeks ago, willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of duty. She was someone else now, someone who had tasted forbidden love and could no longer pretend it didn't exist. A knock at the door made her turn. "Come in." William entered, dressed for travel, his expression calm but serious. "May I speak with you?" "Of course." She gestured to the chair by the window, but he remained standing. "I've been thinking," he began, his hands clasped behind his back, "about how to handle this. The wedding is in 2 weeks. Invitations have been sent. The entire county is expecting a celebration." Elizabeth's chest tightened. "I know, and I understand if you're reconsidering." "I'm not." His voice was firm. "But we need to be strategic. If we simply call it off without explanation, the scandal will destroy both our families. Your reputation will be ruined. And Eduardo—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Eduardo will be blamed whether he deserves it or not." Then what do you propose? William met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. We tell them the truth, or at least a version of it. What do you mean? We tell my mother that we've realized we don't suit, that we've come to this decision mutually with respect and care for one another. He stepped closer. We frame it as an amicable parting. Two people who tried, but ultimately decided they would be better as friends than as husband and wife. Elizabeth's throat tightened. And your mother will accept that? A wry smile touched his lips. My mother won't have a choice. I may not be the Duke, but I'm still her son, and I refuse to marry a woman who loves another man. Tears pricked at her eyes. You're being far kinder than I deserve. Perhaps. He reached out, gently squeezing her hand. Or perhaps I'm simply being honest. I want to be loved, Elizabeth, truly loved, not as a duty but as a choice, and you deserve the same. She looked up at him, her voice breaking. What about Eduardo? William's expression flickered. Pain, resignation, something that looked almost like relief. That's between the two of you. But if you're asking for my blessing... He took a breath. You have it. Elizabeth's composure shattered. She covered her face with her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. William pulled her into a gentle embrace, his hand smoothing over her hair. It's all right, he murmured. It's going to be all right. But even as he said it, they both knew the hardest part was still to come. They told the Duchess that afternoon. William insisted on doing it together, a united front. They found her in the drawing room reviewing floral arrangements with the housekeeper. Mother, we need to speak with you, William said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The Duchess looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing. What is it? William glanced at Elizabeth, then back to his mother. Elizabeth and I have decided not to move forward with the wedding. The silence that followed was deafening. The Duchess set down her pen with exaggerated care, her expression unreadable. I beg your pardon? We've realized, William continued, his voice steady, that we are not well suited for marriage. We hold each other in great esteem, but that is not enough foundation for a lifetime together. The Duchess's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, cold and cutting. Is this true, Miss Sinclair? Elizabeth forced herself to meet those icy eyes. It is, Your Grace. I have the utmost respect for William, but I cannot in good conscience marry him when my heart is not fully committed. Your heart. The Duchess's voice dripped with disdain. How romantic, and how utterly foolish. Mother, William began, but she raised a hand, silencing him. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's reputation? To yours? She rose from her chair, her posture rigid with fury. The invitations have been sent, the arrangements made. The county is expecting a wedding and you wish to cancel it because of sentimentality? It's not sentimentality, William said firmly. It's honesty. I will not trap Elizabeth in a loveless marriage, and I will not trap myself in one either. The Duchess's eyes blazed. And what of duty? What of obligation? What of the promises made between our families? Those promises were made by our fathers, William replied, his voice calm but unyielding, not by us, and I refuse to honor them at the expense of our happiness. For a long moment, the Duchess simply stared at him, her expression a mask of cold fury. Then her gaze shifted to Elizabeth, and something darker flickered in her eyes. This is about Eduardo, isn't it? Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Mother, that's enough, William said sharply. But the Duchess ignored him, her attention fixed on Elizabeth like a predator watching prey. I've seen the way you look at him, the way he disappeared the moment you arrived. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Your Grace, I assure you... Don't. The word was a whip crack. Don't insult my intelligence. You've bewitched him, turned his head with your pretty face and your tragic circumstances, and now you seek to destroy this family from within. That's not true. Elizabeth's voice shook, but she forced herself to stand tall. I never intended for any of this to happen. I came here to fulfill a duty, just as you asked, but I will not marry William when I don't love him. He deserves better than that. What he deserves, the Duchess hissed, is a wife who understands her place. Enough. William's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Mother, you will not speak to her that way. This decision is final. The wedding is off. The Duchess turned her fury on her son. You are making a terrible mistake. Perhaps, William said quietly, but it's mine to make." For a long, agonizing moment the Duchess said nothing. Then she turned away, her spine rigid, her voice ice. "Very well. Destroy your future if you must, but do not come to me when the consequences fall upon you." She swept from the room, leaving a frozen silence in her wake. Elizabeth sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "William, I'm so sorry." "Don't be." He crossed to her, crouching down to meet her eyes. "This needed to happen, and whatever comes next, we'll face it with our heads held high." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. But even as he comforted her, one question burned in her mind. Where was Eduardo? And would he come back now that the wedding was off? The answer came 2 days later. Elizabeth was in the library, trying to lose herself in a book she couldn't focus on, when a commotion erupted in the entrance hall. Raised voices, the sound of boots on marble. Her heart leapt. She set the book aside and hurried to the door, pulling it open just as Eduardo strode into view. He was soaked from the rain, his coat plastered to his shoulders, his dark hair dripping water onto the floor. His eyes were wild, desperate, searching. And then they found her. Time stopped. "Eduardo," she breathed. He crossed the hall in long, urgent strides, stopping just before her, his chest heaving. "Is it true? Tell me it's true." "Is what true?" "The wedding." His voice was raw, ragged. "William sent word. He said you'd called it off." "That you—" He broke off, his hands clenching at his sides as if he didn't trust himself to touch her. "Tell me I didn't imagine it. Tell me it's real." Tears blurred her vision. "It's real." The air left his lungs in a rush. "Why?" "Because I couldn't marry him." Her voice broke. "Because I love you." For one suspended heartbeat, Eduardo simply stared at her, as if afraid that speaking would shatter the moment. Then he moved. His hands framed her face, gentle and reverent, and he kissed her. Deep, desperate, filled with all the longing and fear and hope that had been building between them for weeks. Elizabeth's hands fisted in his wet coat, pulling him closer, kissing him back with everything she had. This wasn't a goodbye, this wasn't stolen, this was theirs. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling, foreheads pressed together, breathing hard. "I came back," he whispered against her lips. "The moment I got William's letter, I rode through the night. I had to see you, I had to know—" "I'm here," she murmured, her hands cradling his face. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You should." His voice was thick with emotion. "You should run from this place, from this family, from me. I'm broken, Elizabeth. I'm my father's son, cold, distant, impossible to love." "Stop." She pressed her fingers to his lips, her eyes fierce. "You are not your father. You are the man who loved me when he had no right to. The man who left to protect me. The man who came back." Her voice softened. "You are the man I choose, Eduardo. Not out of duty, not out of obligation, but because I want you." His eyes glistened, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him, truly saw him, not the Duke, not the distant, controlled facade, but the man beneath, vulnerable, aching, real. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Then spend the rest of your life trying to." She smiled through her tears. "Because I'm not letting you go, not now, not ever." He kissed her again, slower this time, tender and full of promise. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. But the storm at last was breaking. The days following Eduardo's return were unlike anything Elizabeth had ever known. There was no wedding to prepare for, no pretense to maintain. Just the raw, fragile truth of what they'd chosen, and the consequences that came with it. The Duchess refused to speak to either of them. She took her meals in her private chambers, issued orders through servants, and moved through the manor like a ghost draped in disapproval. Her silence was louder than any rebuke. William, to his credit, handled the dissolution of the engagement with grace. He penned letters to guests, citing unforeseen circumstances and mutual respect, deflecting the worst of the gossip with carefully chosen words. When he passed Elizabeth in the corridors, he offered kind smiles and reassurances that she didn't deserve. But it was Eduardo who bore the heaviest weight. Elizabeth saw it in the tension that never left his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when servants whispered as he passed, the sleepless nights that left shadows beneath his eyes. He was the Duke, the head of the family, and his choice to pursue his brother's former betrothed was a scandal that would follow them all. Yet he never wavered. 1 week after the engagement ended, Eduardo found Elizabeth in the garden, her favorite sanctuary. She sat beneath the willow tree, a book unopened in her lap, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. He approached slowly, as if afraid to disturb her peace. "May I join you?" She looked up, and the sight of him still stole her breath. He wore no coat, just shirt sleeves and a waistcoat. His cravat loosened as if he'd been tugging at it. His dark hair was windswept, and his eyes, those impossibly deep eyes, held a vulnerability that made her chest ache. "Always," she said softly. He sat beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them hummed with life. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of the manor. "I've been thinking," Eduardo said finally, his voice low, "about what comes next." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "And?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I want to marry you, Elizabeth. Properly, publicly. I want the world to know that you are mine and I am yours." Her breath caught. "Eduardo, but I won't ask you to make that choice lightly." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "If you marry me, you will face judgment. Society will call you opportunistic, calculating. They'll say you seduced one brother and discarded him for another. The whispers will follow us for years." "I don't care what they say," she said fiercely. "You should." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I need you to understand what you're choosing. This won't be easy. My mother will never forgive us. William will carry the sting of this, no matter how gracious he's been. And the Ashford name, our legacy, will be tainted." "Then we'll rebuild it," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "Together." He studied her face, searching for doubt. "You're certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She squeezed his hand. "I love you, Eduardo. Not your title, not your wealth. You. The man who sees me, who chose me even when it cost him everything." His eyes glistened, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "Then marry me. Not because you have to. Not because it's expected, but because you want to." "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world spinning out of control. She buried her face in his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for the first time in weeks she felt safe, whole, home. The announcement was made quietly, without fanfare. Eduardo sent word to the family solicitor, instructing him to arrange a special license. They would marry in the chapel on the estate, with only William as witness. The Duchess predictably exploded. Elizabeth heard the shouting from 3 rooms away, the Duchess's voice sharp and venomous, Eduardo's low and immovable. When he finally emerged from the drawing room, his face was pale but resolute. "She's disowning me," he said flatly, finding Elizabeth in the library where she'd been waiting. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "What?" "Not officially. She can't, legally. But she's made it clear that if I marry you, I am no longer her son in any way that matters." His voice was calm, but she could see the pain flickering beneath the surface. "Eduardo, I can't let you lose your family because of me. You're not making me lose anything." He crossed to her, cupping her face in his hands. "I'm choosing you. And if they can't accept that, then they were never truly family to begin with. But your mother, my mother has spent her entire life prioritizing reputation over happiness. I will not make the same mistake." His voice softened. "You are my family now, Elizabeth. You are all I need." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and he kissed them away one by one, gentle and reverent. "We'll be all right," he murmured against her skin. "I promise you." And despite everything, the scandal, the judgment, the fractured relationships, Elizabeth believed him. The wedding took place on a grey morning 2 weeks later. The chapel was small and austere, its stone walls cold and ancient. Rain pattered against the stained glass windows, casting coloured shadows across the floor. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond William, who stood quietly to the side. Elizabeth wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. No veil, no jewels. Just her, standing before the man she loved, ready to bind herself to him in the eyes of God and law. Eduardo stood at the altar, dressed in black, his expression solemn. But when Elizabeth walked down the aisle, alone, without a father or guardian to give her away, his face transformed. The solemnity cracked, replaced by something raw and achingly tender. Love. Pure. Unguarded. Infinite. The vicar spoke the words, the ancient vows that had bound countless couples before them. Elizabeth repeated them, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I, Elizabeth Sinclair, take you, Eduardo Ashford. And when Eduardo spoke his vows, his voice broke. I, Eduardo Ashford, take you, Elizabeth Sinclair, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. His hands trembled as he slid the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band, warm and solid, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Eduardo kissed her with a tenderness that made the world fall away. It wasn't the grand wedding she'd once been promised, but it was real, and it was theirs. William approached them afterward as they stood together in the chapel, hands clasped, foreheads touching. May I? He asked quietly. Eduardo turned, his expression guarded. William offered a small, sad smile. I wanted to congratulate you both, properly. Elizabeth stepped forward, her throat tight. William, I don't know how to thank you. Don't. He shook his head. You've already thanked me by being honest. That's more than most people have the courage to do. He extended his hand to Eduardo. Take care of her, brother. Eduardo clasped his hand, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other, years of brotherhood, rivalry, and unspoken pain passing between them. I will, Eduardo said quietly. You have my word. William nodded, then turned to Elizabeth, pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek. Be happy, he murmured. Both of you. And then he was gone, walking out into the rain, leaving them alone in the quiet chapel. That night, Eduardo took Elizabeth to the east wing of the manor, his private chambers, a place she'd never been. The rooms were simpler than she'd expected. Dark wood furniture, shelves lined with books, a fireplace crackling with warmth. No ostentatious displays of wealth, just comfortable lived-in space. This is where I've been hiding, he admitted, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Away from the chaos, away from expectations. It's perfect, she said softly. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Elizabeth Ashford, he said, testing the name. My wife. She smiled, crossing to him, her hands sliding up his chest to rest against his shoulders. Your wife, she repeated. How strange and wonderful that sounds. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. I never thought I'd have this. A life beyond duty. A love beyond arrangement. Neither did I. And yet here we are. His hands traced the curve of her waist, reverent and sure. Against all odds, against all reason. Maybe reason is overrated, she whispered. He laughed, a low, genuine sound that warmed her from the inside out. Maybe it is. And then he kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of promise and forever. They stood there in the firelight, wrapped in each other, the world outside forgotten. Tomorrow they would face the consequences, the whispers, the judgment, the fractured family. But tonight they had this. They had each other, and that was enough. The first month of marriage was both blissful and brutal. Elizabeth moved into Eduardo's chambers, and they built a world within those walls, a sanctuary where titles and scandals couldn't reach them. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. Eduardo taught her chess by the fire, and she read poetry to him while rain drummed against the windows. They learned each other's rhythms, the small intimacies that made a marriage real. But beyond their rooms, the manor remained a battlefield. The Duchess had taken up residence in the West Wing, establishing her own court of silent disapproval. She dined alone, received no visitors, and communicated only through terse notes delivered by servants. When Elizabeth passed her in the corridors, rare, carefully avoided encounters, the older woman's gaze would slide past her as if she were invisible. A ghost in her own home. William had left for London shortly after the wedding, claiming business that required his attention. His letters to Eduardo were polite but distant, filled with updates on estate matters and carefully void of anything personal. The brothers who had once shared a childhood now communicated like strangers. And the gossip. God. The gossip. It spread through the county like wildfire. At church, women whispered behind gloved hands. At market, conversations stopped when Elizabeth appeared. Invitations that should have arrived for the new Duchess of Thornfield never came. Society had rendered its judgment. She was a schemer, a temptress, a woman who had destroyed one engagement to secure a better match. Eduardo bore the brunt of it with stoic silence, but Elizabeth saw what it cost him, the tightness around his eyes when letters arrived bearing the seals of old friends who now declined his correspondence. The set of his jaw when tenants who'd once greeted him warmly now looked away. "I'm destroying everything you've built," Elizabeth whispered one night, lying in his arms, her voice thick with tears. He pulled her closer, his hand smoothing through her hair. "You're not destroying anything. You're rebuilding me into someone who finally knows what matters. Your legacy, my legacy, is what I choose it to be, and I choose you." He tilted her face up, his dark eyes fierce. "Every single time I choose you," but choosing her came with a price neither of them had fully anticipated. 6 weeks after the wedding, Eduardo received a summons from the House of Lords. Elizabeth found him in his study, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face ashen. "What is it?" she asked, her heart already sinking. He handed her the letter wordlessly. She read it once, twice. The words blurred, but the meaning was clear. Several peers, longtime allies of the Ashford family, were calling for an inquiry into Eduardo's fitness to hold his seat. They cited moral impropriety and conduct unbecoming a peer of the realm. In short, they wanted him stripped of his title. "They can't do this," Elizabeth breathed, horror washing over her. "Can they?" "They can try." Eduardo's voice was hollow. "If enough of them vote, yes, they can remove me from the Lords, disgrace the family name permanently. Because of me." The words tasted like ash. "Because you married me. Because I chose love over politics." He stood, crossing to the window, his shoulders rigid. "And because certain men in power believe that makes me weak." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she set the letter down. "Then we'll fight them. We'll prove that what we did was what, Elizabeth?" He turned, and the raw pain in his eyes cut her to the bone. "Honorable. We broke an engagement. I pursued my brother's betrothed. By every measure of society's rules, I am guilty. But we fell in love. Love is not a defense in their eyes." His voice cracked. "It's a liability, evidence of poor judgment and uncontrolled passions." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Elizabeth's mind raced. "What if I left?" Eduardo's head snapped up. "What? What if we annulled the marriage, said it was a mistake? I could go to the continent, disappear." "No." The word was a command, sharp and absolute. He crossed to her in 3 strides, gripping her shoulders. "Don't you dare suggest that. But if it saves you—" "I don't want to be saved at that cost." His hands trembled against her arms. "I would rather lose everything, my title, my seat, my fortune, than lose you." Tears streamed down her face. "Eduardo." "I mean it, Elizabeth." His forehead dropped to hers, his voice breaking. "You are the only thing that matters, the only thing that's real. Without you, what am I? A duke with no purpose. A title with no heart." She wrapped her arms around him, holding him as tightly as she could. "Then we face this together, whatever comes." He kissed her, desperate, clinging, and she kissed him back with everything she had. They would fight, and they would survive. They had to. The inquiry was scheduled for 3 weeks later in London. Eduardo spent hours in his study, preparing his defense with his solicitor. Elizabeth watched him work himself to exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep. She wanted to help, but what could she do? She was the reason he was in this position. One evening, unable to bear the helplessness any longer, she slipped out of the manor and walked to the small parish church at the edge of the estate. Inside, the air was cool and still, scented with candle wax and old wood. Elizabeth sank into a pew, her hands clasped in her lap, and for the first time in years she prayed, not for salvation, not for forgiveness, for strength, for Eduardo, for them. "I thought I might find you here." she gasped, turning. William stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his expression unreadable. "William." She rose quickly. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in London." "I was." He moved down the aisle, stopping a few feet away. "I heard about the inquiry." Shame burned through her. "I'm so sorry, this is all my fault." "It's not." His voice was firm. "If anyone is to blame, it's the hypocrites in Parliament who've done far worse and never faced consequences." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "Why did you come back?" William held her gaze, his blue eyes steady. "Because Eduardo is my brother, and despite everything, I won't let them destroy him without a fight." Hope flickered, fragile and desperate. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to testify on his behalf." He stepped closer. "I'll tell them the truth, that you and I both realized we weren't suited, that Eduardo had nothing to do with the decision to end the engagement, that he acted with honor even when it cost him dearly." "William," tears blurred her vision. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." A sad smile touched his lips. "He's my brother, and you make him happy in a way I've never seen. That has to count for something." Elizabeth crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "Thank you, you have no idea what this means." He squeezed her hands gently. "Just promise me something. Anything. Love him well. Make all of this worth it." "I will," she whispered. "I promise." 3 weeks later, Elizabeth and Eduardo travelled to London. The city was grey and imposing, its streets crowded with carriages and noise. They stayed at the Ashford townhouse, a grand but cold residence that had been in the family for generations. The night before the inquiry, Eduardo couldn't sleep. Elizabeth found him in the library, staring into the fire, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. "Come to bed," she said softly. He didn't turn. "What if they strip me of everything, Elizabeth? What if I become nothing?" She crossed to him, kneeling beside his chair so she could look up into his face. "Then you'll still be the man I love, the man who chose honesty over convenience, the man who showed me that love is worth fighting for." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "How did I find you?" "You didn't." She smiled through her tears. "I found you." He pulled her into his lap, holding her close, and they sat there in the firelight, drawing strength from each other. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The inquiry took place in a grand chamber in Westminster, with high ceilings and rows of stern-faced peers. Eduardo stood before them, his posture straight, his expression calm. But Elizabeth, seated in the gallery, could see the tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on the rail before him. One by one the accusations were read: conduct unbecoming, moral impropriety, breach of honor. And then it was time for the defense. William took the stand. He spoke with quiet authority, recounting the events with brutal honesty. He testified that the engagement had been his decision to end, that Elizabeth had acted with integrity, that Eduardo had stayed away precisely to avoid impropriety. "My brother," William said, his voice ringing through the chamber, "is guilty of only one thing: loving a woman he had no right to love, and choosing her anyway. If that is a crime, then we are all guilty. Every man in this room who has ever acted on his heart, rather than his head." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Then Eduardo spoke. He didn't defend himself with excuses or justifications. Instead, he spoke of love, of choice, of the difference between duty and honor. "I did not choose this lightly," he said, his voice steady. "I knew the cost, I knew what I would lose, and I chose it anyway. Because love, true love, demands courage. It demands sacrifice. And I would rather be a man who loved honestly than a duke who lived a lie." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the peers voted. Elizabeth held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles went white. The final count was read. The motion to strip Eduardo of his title failed. Barely. But it failed. Relief crashed over Elizabeth like a wave, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Eduardo's shoulders sagged, and for just a moment he closed his eyes. He had won. They had won. That night, back at the townhouse, Eduardo pulled Elizabeth into his arms and held her as if he would never let go. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." "Not over," she corrected, pulling back to look at him. "Just beginning." He smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "Just beginning," he agreed. And he kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of victory and promise and forever. Spring came to Ashford Manor like a benediction. The gardens burst into bloom, roses climbing the stone walls, lavender spilling over pathways, cherry blossoms drifting through the air like snow. The world that had seemed so cold and unforgiving just months before now teemed with life and colour. Elizabeth stood in the garden, her hands resting on the fountain's edge, watching the water catch the sunlight. She wore a simple gown of pale green muslin, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. The warmth of the sun on her skin felt like forgiveness. So much had changed. After the inquiry, they had returned to the manor expecting the same cold reception, the same whispers and judgment. But something had shifted. Word of William's testimony had spread through the county, his defense of his brother, his grace in the face of scandal. Society, always fickle, began to soften. Invitations trickled in. At church, a few brave souls offered tentative smiles. The tenants, who had always respected Eduardo, seemed relieved to see him vindicated. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. The Duchess remained the last holdout. She still kept to the West Wing, still communicated through servants, still moved through the manor like a spectre of disapproval. But Elizabeth noticed small changes. The notes were less curt. The glances in the corridor lingered a fraction longer, as if the older woman was reconsidering her position. Eduardo noticed too. "She's weakening," he said one evening, as they sat together in the library. "My mother is many things, but she's not cruel. Not truly, just afraid." "Afraid of what?" Elizabeth asked, looking up from her book. "Of change. Of losing control." He set down his own reading, his expression thoughtful. "She spent her entire life building the Ashford legacy. In her mind, I nearly destroyed it. But you didn't. I know that, you know that, even William knows that." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "But my mother, she needs time to see it." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "Then we give her time." The breakthrough came unexpectedly, 6 weeks after their return from London. Elizabeth had been working in the rose garden, pruning and tending the plants with the help of the head gardener. It was therapeutic work, quiet, purposeful, grounding. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the Duchess approaching until the older woman spoke. "Those roses were my late husband's favourite." Elizabeth startled, nearly dropping her shears. She turned to find the Duchess standing at the edge of the garden, her expression unreadable. "Your Grace." Elizabeth set down her tools, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't hear you." The Duchess didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the roses, deep red blooms that climbed the trellis in cascading waves. "He planted them himself," she continued, her voice softer than Elizabeth had ever heard it. "The year Eduardo was born, he said they would outlast us all." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "They're beautiful." "Yes." The Duchess stepped closer, reaching out to touch one of the petals with surprising gentleness. "He would have liked you, I think." The words hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. Elizabeth's eyes burned with tears. "Your Grace, I have been unkind to you." The Duchess's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it. "Unjustly so. You were not the architect of this situation. You were simply caught in it, as we all were." "I never meant to cause harm," Elizabeth whispered. "To you, to William, to this family. I know." The Duchess finally looked at her, and for the first time Elizabeth saw past the coldness to the grief beneath. "I know that now. William made it quite clear in his letters, and Eduardo—" She paused, her expression softening. "Eduardo has never been happier. I cannot ignore that, no matter how much I might wish to." Elizabeth's tears spilled over. "I love him. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I can see that." The Duchess's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "And he loves you, with a fierceness that terrifies me, if I'm honest." "Why does it terrify you?" The Duchess was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was almost wistful. "Because it reminds me of what I once had, and lost." Elizabeth's heart clenched. "I'm sorry." Don't be." The Duchess straightened, her composure sliding back into place. "The past is past. What matters now is the future." She met Elizabeth's gaze squarely. "I would like to try again if you're willing." "Of course," Elizabeth said quickly, her voice thick with emotion. "I would like that very much." The Duchess nodded once, crisp and formal, but as she turned to leave, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Welcome to the family, Elizabeth." And then she was gone, leaving Elizabeth standing among the roses, her heart full to bursting. That evening, Elizabeth found Eduardo in his study, reviewing estate ledgers by candlelight. "Your mother spoke to me today," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up immediately, his eyes searching hers. "And?" "She apologized, in her own way." Elizabeth crossed to him, perching on the edge of his desk. "She said she wants to try again." Eduardo set down his pen, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper. Relief, hope, cautious joy. "Truly? Truly." He pulled her into his lap, burying his face in the curve of her neck. "Thank God," he murmured. "I didn't realize how much I needed that until now." She held him close, her fingers threading through his hair. "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" He pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes shining. "More than all right, we're going to be happy." And in that moment, Elizabeth believed him. Summer arrived in a blaze of golden light and endless blue skies. William returned from London, looking lighter somehow, as if he'd shed a weight he'd been carrying for too long. He joined them for dinner, and for the first time since the scandal, the conversation flowed easily, laughter, teasing, the comfortable rhythm of family. The Duchess even smiled. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room after dinner, William raised his glass. "A toast," he said, his eyes warm, "to new beginnings, and to love, in all its unexpected forms." Eduardo lifted his glass, his other hand finding Elizabeth's beneath the table. "To new beginnings." They drank, and Elizabeth felt the last piece of her heart settle into place. This was home, not the manor, not the title, not the legacy. These people, this love. A year later, Elizabeth stood in the same garden where she'd first found peace, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Eduardo came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his hands covering hers. "How are you feeling?" he murmured against her hair. "Happy," she said simply, "so unbelievably happy." He turned her in his arms, his eyes soft with wonder. "I still can't believe it sometimes. That you're mine. That this," he touched her belly gently, "is ours." "Believe it," she whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him. "We're real. All of this is real." He kissed her back, slow and tender, a kiss that spoke of gratitude and joy, and a love that had survived every test. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Elizabeth Ashford." "I love you too," she replied, "from the very first moment, and every moment after." They stood there in the garden, wrapped in each other, the future stretching out before them like an open road. The scandal had faded into memory, the whispers had quieted, the wounds had begun to heal. And what remained was this: two souls who had found each other against all odds. Two hearts that refused to be separated, a love that defied duty, expectation, and fear, a love that chose courage. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. 5 years later, the gardens of Ashford Manor were alive with laughter. Two children, a boy of 4 with his father's dark eyes and a girl of 2 with her mother's wild curls, chased each other through the roses, their giggles echoing through the air. Elizabeth sat on a blanket beneath the willow tree, watching them with a smile that never quite faded these days. Beside her, Eduardo lay with his head in her lap, his eyes closed, his expression peaceful. "They're going to destroy those flower beds," he murmured, though there was no real concern in his voice. "Let them," Elizabeth said, running her fingers through his hair. "The flowers will grow back. Childhood won't." He opened one eye, looking up at her with affection. "When did you become so wise?" "When I married you," he laughed, pulling her down for a kiss that made the children shriek with exaggerated disgust. "Mama! Papa! Stop being silly!" Elizabeth pulled back, grinning. "Never." Eduardo sat up, catching their son as he barreled into them. swinging him up into the air. The boy's laughter was pure joy, and Elizabeth's heart swelled watching them. The Duchess emerged from the manor, walking slowly with the aid of a cane now, but her eyes were warm as she watched her grandchildren play. William appeared moments later, a young woman on his arm, Lady Catherine, a widow he'd been courting for the past year. She was kind, intelligent, and utterly smitten with him. They were talking about marriage. The family gathered beneath the willow tree, and for a moment, Elizabeth simply took it all in. This life they'd built. This love they'd fought for. This impossible, beautiful, perfectly imperfect family. Eduardo caught her eye and smiled, that private smile that was only ever for her. She smiled back, her heart full. They had started with a single glance across a storm-soaked courtyard. A moment that should have meant nothing, but it had meant everything, and here they were, still choosing each other, still falling, still loving, from the very first moment. Thank you for taking this journey with Eduardo and Elizabeth. Their story is a testament to the power of choosing love over duty, courage over fear, and truth over convenience. May you find your own impossible love worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, leave a comment telling me where you're from, and share this with someone who believes in second chances and first loves that last forever.
In the quiet halls of borrowed time, where duty breathes and hearts must wait, I saw your eyes before I knew your name, and fate began to hesitate. Your smile was not meant for my world, your hand was promised not to me. Yet every step I took away from you pulled you deeper into me. They taught me love is sacrifice, a silence dressed as grace, but no one warned me how it feels to lose you every day. I loved you without a word, without a claim, without a rhyme. In every breath I never took, in every sleepless night, I loved you where love must hide, where honor stands in the way. You were the truth I couldn't choose, but never walked away. Spoken carefully, like something holy, something old. And I became the shadow in the room when promises were told. He offered you a future safe, a life the world would bless. I offered nothing but a heart that loved you nonetheless. If loving you my sin, then let it mark my soul, for I would rather carry this than live a life untouched.